I want you guys to think of two different things. I want you to think of Down syndrome, and I want you to think of Down syndrome persons. And I also want you to think about genocide. And while these two things may not have a correlation at the moment, my hope is that by the end of this lecture, I can have bridged a gap between the two and to show you the current genocidal trends that I believe are facing our society today. When did this begin? Well, back in the 60s, doctors, gynecologists, obstetricians began tracking women and their proneness to having Down syndrome children. Mainly, they use this tracker based on a woman's age. For example, a woman who was in her 20s to 30s typically wasn't at a high risk to have a Down syndrome child. However, doctors noticed in the 60s that women who were in the upper echelon of their age, or 40s, 50s per se, typically had a higher risk for having a Down syndrome child. Now, this research ended up rolling into the late 80s research that doctors realized that this could not only be correlated with a woman's age, but it could also be correlated with specific proteins and aminos that are secreted and that are just secreted in a woman's blood when she is pregnant. Now, based on that, doctors began increasing technology, and by the early 2000s, the American College of Gynecologists and Obstetricians issued a practice bulletin that made these non-invasive blood samples to be a mandatory part of a pregnant mother's to-be healthcare routine. Now, what is the significance of this? Well, since the implementation of this practice bulletin in America specifically, Down syndrome fetuses have been aborted between 80 to 90% every single time that they are tested positively for Down syndrome. And before I go on, I also want to note that these are not conclusive results. These non-invasive tests, these non-invasive blood draws are not conclusive as to whether or not this fetus actually does have Down syndrome. And in fact, as I kept researching, I realized that doctors also said, hey, if this test does come back positively, and if you are afraid that your child may have Down syndrome, we highly suggest that you seek out extra tests. Go and see what the size of the heart looks like. Go and see if their bones are growing to a certain size. Now, based on these basic implementations, right? We have that big 80 to 90%, yeah, we abort. But even with low-risk children that don't test positively for Down syndrome, they could still be born with Down syndrome. And in fact, in 2009, Iceland had 3 children that were low rate for Down syndrome that were actually born with Down syndrome based on these initial tests. And this isn't just affecting America. Since these practice guidelines have been implemented in America and in Europe, we currently are at a 77% abortion rate in France for fetuses with Down syndrome that test positively for Down syndrome. In the United Kingdom, it's a 90% termination rate. In Denmark, it's a 98% termination rate. And my most favorite of all, Iceland is at a 100% termination rate. I'll let that one sink in for a second. 100% of fetuses that test positively for Down syndrome are aborted in Iceland. And in fact, it's not just that is happening in Europe. We're not just aborting, but European health insurance companies are actually beginning to implement compensation for Down syndrome abortions. So for example, if somebody does have the fetus that tests positively for Down syndrome, a health insurance company will actually incentivize and say, we will pay for you to abort this fetus with your health insurance policy. In addition to that, Iceland has also began offering women who are debating between whether or not to abort or whether to keep their fetus with life coaches or counselors. And I specifically remember watching a CBS On Assignment video where there was a counselor who sat down and said that they encourage women to abort fetuses with Down syndrome because they don't see this as killing. They don't see it as ending a life. They see it as something that never started, putting an end to something that never started. And she, in fact, said that life is gray, that there is no difference between whether or not this child was going to normally grow or whether or not this child would have Down syndrome, that it's so gray that it doesn't really faze them. And in addition to that, eugenicists and ethicists in Europe and in parts of Australia have quoted and been remarked to say that this is a good thing. They, in fact, have said that places such as Denmark could be Down syndrome free by the year 2030. Now, if you think that I went to college yesterday, that's tomorrow. That is a real tomorrow. And in fact, Iceland is there today. So, with that, this issue is not mutually exclusive to Europe. This issue is in America, right here, right now. Currently, we're at a 60% abortion rate for fetuses that test positively for Down syndrome, just on those minimal, non-invasive blood scans that I mentioned earlier. And on top of that, if any of you guys have seen or read in the news, current states are wrestling with Down syndrome legislation. And just to name a few, North Dakota, Ohio, Indiana, Louisiana, and Utah are currently or have passed legislation regarding or actually outlining the specific election to terminate fetuses with Down syndrome. In Indiana, actually, they passed the law in early 2017, but later on that year, in September specifically, that law was struck down on constitutional grounds. And if you guys have seen, it was in the news a couple of weeks ago, Ohio actually had passed a law that said that fetuses for Down syndrome that were being electively aborted, this is not okay, it's unconstitutional, all of these things. However, Justice Timothy Black of the United States District Court of Ohio actually has overturned that law. And he said this: the law has indicated a wrongfully prohibited women from making the ultimate decision to terminate before viability. Now, I won't get into viability, and I won't get into that constitutional argument per se, because this is a human rights-based argument. But based on that constitutional precedence that the Supreme Court has set, the judge went on to say that this law actually violated the right to privacy of every woman in Ohio and is completely unconstitutional on its face. And in addition to legislation that we've been battling with here in the United States, Ruth Marcus from the Washington Post recently wrote an article completely dedicated to why she would have aborted a child had they tested positively for Down syndrome. In fact, she said, "I would have terminated those pregnancies had the testing come back positive." Now, mind you, this is a mother of 3 children, and I do hope that one day her children read those words and take into consideration that had they had Down syndrome, they would in fact not be here today. But moving on, she went on to say that most children with Down syndrome have mild to moderate cognitive impairment, meaning that an IQ between 55 and 70, or between 35 and 55. That means that they have a limited capacity for independent living, financial security, and Down syndrome is life-altering for the entire family. And Ms. Marcus does a beautiful job bringing up 3 things that I feel are the biggest justifications for aborting fetuses with Down syndrome. First, suffering. Second, finances. And third, independence regarding the family. I would like to address suffering first. Mostly when I talk to people about my topic and when I tell them about my heart regarding how much time and energy and effort I've put into this, they always look at me and they say, Emily, but these people are suffering. Don't you get that? Why do you support women? Why do you support families bringing in people who are just going to suffer in the end? Think about it. Everybody suffers, do we not? I suffer, you suffer. Suffering is inevitable. We can never prevent that. And through death, we can never wholly eradicate suffering. That is just not an answer in my book. Before his passing, the famous Richard Dawkins on Twitter argued that of individuals born with Down syndrome and their families, we should strive to reduce suffering whenever possible. But like I said, we can't eradicate suffering. It's impossible. Now, mind you, there's no denying that raising a child with Down syndrome will have its struggles. And there's no denying that raising a child with Down syndrome will have different health and medical implications. However, isn't raising a child suffering in and of itself? Isn't raising another human? You can ask my parents, they're here. They probably suffered, they're still suffering today. They are still suffering today. But it's interesting because raising a child, regardless of whether it has Down syndrome or the child is normally growing, as everyone else would say, we will all inevitably suffer in one way or another. But what I found really interesting in my research is that studies have shown that families with children who have Down syndrome have levels of well-being that are often greater than families with children who are not disabled. And in fact, I found a really fascinating research done by Harvard who said that in 2007, divorce rates of homes with children who are living with Down syndrome were lower on average than those with children who had normal cognitive abilities. And if you think that's incredible, my most favorite stat of this all is 88% of persons who have younger siblings that are living with Down syndrome have said that they themselves feel better because of their sibling, that their sibling has actually encouraged them to be a better person, that their sibling causes them to strive to be a better human being simply because of who their sibling is. Not because they are normally growing, not because they're suffering more than you or I, but because of who they are, their innate being. And on top of that, people living with Down syndrome have spoken about this very topic. In fact, in a survey, 99% of people said that they were happy with their lives. That's incredible. Who can say that they are outright, I'm happy with my life? 99% of people in this very study. 97% of these participants said that they liked who they are and that they described themselves as being happy. And in fact, I have done hours of research, many a YouTube nights just spent watching entrepreneurs with Down syndrome. I've watched people with Down syndrome go to college. They have degrees. They are successfully integrated into society. So what part about suffering did you hear from those statistics? Because based on that, these people are living incredible lives and they're doing incredible things. And it's not just about them. They're in fact influencing their families. Mark A. Thiessen from the Washington Post, in response to Ms. Marcus, actually wrote, "Sadly, there will always be those who see people with Down syndrome as nothing more than a burden on society." Now, going back to the three main things that I brought up, wrongful life is another issue that a lot of people will ask me about when I just talk to them in conversations about my topic. Now, a wrongful life claim is based on a number of different things that I don't have time to go into, but The main basis of this claim is essentially that had doctors, had practicing medical experts advised that this child would have Down syndrome, the parents would have in turn elected to abort, and thus they wouldn't have ushered a wrongful life, a not worthy life into the world to raise, right? But based on my research, there is no legal and cognizable injury that comes from a wrongful life claim, from common law or based on a statute. And now, again, we could talk about this a little bit more on sidebar, but based on a quick glance, it seemed to me that wrongful life claims weren't actually rooted in the law. Rather, it appeared that wrongful life claims were more financially based claims, and like Ms. Marcus said, they are household burdens. They are burdens on the family, which in turn means that they are financial burdens on the family. So getting into that, the American Journal of Medical Genetics actually conducted an experiment. They did an experiment and they gathered a bunch of statistics based on out-of-pocket expenses that families do typically have when they have a Down syndrome child. Their research found that Down syndrome, having a Down syndrome child, is actually less than $100 a month more than a typically developing child. On average, a household will actually incur a total of $1,014 a year, and that broke down to $88 a month in medical expenses. Now, if you think about that, for a normal earning home in the United States, good income, that doesn't sound like very much, does it? $84. When I think about a big burden on families, I think of thousands of dollars a month. Families are struggling. There are all of these issues. And you know what? You might be sitting there thinking, you know what, Emily, $100 might be a lot for a certain type of family. And you're right. I'm not going to debate you on that, and I'm not going to say that you're wrong. I think that there is a type of burden that could be associated with having a Down syndrome child and $100 a month extra. But of course, there is this state disability that families do receive if a child is medically fragile. And in that, we also have special needs trusts that can actually be set up as a financial solution for people who are struggling. So what that does, a really quick overview for special needs trusts, is families can put money into this trust, and the trust does not actually negate the money that families will be receiving from the state that the child will be receiving for their special disabilities, which works to their advantage because the state says, all right, here's your extra money that you are specifically setting aside for unforeseen or for foreseen medical reasons for your child. However, we will still continue to give you state aid. And based on that, I think that there is a pretty even playing field, per se, when it comes to the fact that wrongful life claims, number one, don't have any sort of remedy at common law or statute-based. And even if this was based in a financial argument, there are so many different financial opportunities and abilities for people to actually support their child living with Down syndrome. I actually had a conversation with Professor Deloach, and I didn't follow up on this, but there are medical expenditures that my family has for different reasons, and I was sort of looking at it, and I thought to myself, wow, this is a typically growing person. This is a person who doesn't have any sort of issues, disabilities, but in fact, a Down syndrome child is cheaper than the finances that my family has incurred ourselves, which is pretty fascinating and pretty interesting, and something that, of course, we can follow up with later on. So, Down syndrome. Now let's bridge the gap into genocide. Currently, genocide describes the destruction of a nation or of an ethnic group. And this term is an elastic term. It basically says, hey, we will protect mass atrocities. For example, the Holocaust. That is recognized as genocide, and everybody notices that as the first genocide that comes into their minds. But this also is able to come in close and say specific or broad killings can also be protected under this term of genocide. However, based on the current legal protection, the current genocide that I'm trying to argue regarding Down syndrome doesn't fit into this definition. More specifically, on the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, there are only 4 protected classes: race, religion, gender, and ethnicity. So based on that large, broad scope of mass killings, arguably, Down syndrome would fit in there, right? Because what? We have 100%, 98%, 97%, 70%, 60%, all in different countries. But based on that current protection, those 4 classes, we can't fit genocide, or we can't fit Down syndrome into those protections. And now, here's the tweak in the argument. I'm not arguing that this is actually fitting genocide, because I just admitted that it can't. But this is a genocidal trend that stands before us that could become and could elevate to that particular point. And this is why. Dr. Gregory Stanton actually lists out 10 different stages of genocide. He says the stages go like this: classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and denial. Now, I have done a lot of time marinating with these 10 stages, and it has been very difficult, and it has taken a very creative thought, though the law is not necessarily creative. It has taken a lot to go through each stage, because I don't think it would be fair to sit here before you and say, oh yes, this issue with Down syndrome fits every single stage, because that's not the truth. But the 4 main stages that I would like to point out to you, I do believe Down syndrome and the current termination rates fit in well. For example, the first stage of classification. Dr. Stanton boils this down to us and to them. And in this particular case, us and them becomes clear. Us, normally developing, them, not normally developing, right? This is actually really teased out in the sense of, you guys have trisomy 1821 in the medical term, and you guys are normal people. And moving into another stage, symbolization. Dr. Stanton says that this happens when we name the us and the them. Well, there you go. There we have it. They're named Down syndrome. They have Down syndrome, and you don't. So we have our classification that turns into symbolization, but we also have persecution. And the persecution stage basically sits there and says, all right, I see you victims, and I am going to separate you victims from the rest of the group. Now, how is this done? Well, it's done on a couple of different levels. Number 1, we separate the victim by identifying them through a blood test. So even before this individual is born, we separate them and say, you have been classified and you are symbolized because you carry an involuntary thing, which is an extra chromosome. Now, based on that, we also say, hey, this genetic modification, it can't be with us. We need to put this over here and we need to make a decision about it, right? That also spirals into health insurance policies giving women incentives to abort for fetuses with Down syndrome. That also rolls into counselors being given for women who are vacillating between whether to keep or whether to abort. And the final stage, and I think the most obvious stage that we have right now, is the extermination stage, which Dr. Stanton says is the getting rid of stage, is the actual act of carrying out the extermination or the killing of this particular group. And as I've mentioned to you, we are at 100% in Iceland. And if that's not extermination, I don't know what else is. Now, what can we do about this? Where do we see this going? I see this as a cry for reform, especially international reform. And when it comes to the law, as I've mentioned to you, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide needs to be marginally expanded. Now, I sort of throw myself out there on the line for a lot of criticism when it comes to this legally, because to expand something is almost to say, all right, I'm going to give you an inch, but everybody wants a mile. And I don't want this mile to be given. I only want the inch. And this is why. If marginal expansion happens, and in the way that I hope to have it happening, that means that not only will Down syndrome persons be protected, but other persons could also be protected in it as well. And it's also good to note the fact that I don't want this convention and the potency of it to be diluted, especially because this is a crime that is very serious. And it's something that I don't want people to think that I'm trying to downplay, especially when we are talking about the Jewish Holocaust, when we talk about Rwanda. Those are very serious matters that are at hand, especially on the human rights level. And by no means do I want anybody to walk away thinking that those are any less significant because I want the convention to be expanded. Now, what would that entail? Well, before this convention was actually put in place before the UN, the proposal for the groups were political groups, race, gender, ethnicity, and what was my last one? Nationality. Thank you, Professor. Those were the original 5 groups that were proposed. Now, mind you, political group was the first one that was in there. And based on my research and my studies, a lot of the UN has come back and said that had they included political groups, it would have rocked the boat, per se, because there are quite a number of different classifications that could come in under political groups. And political groups isn't really a solid definition legally at this point. And I think that, again, if you want to talk to me about political groups in that sort of whole era and what I think about that, let's grab coffee sometime. But I think that political groups, especially in this case, should be included. Why? Because Down syndrome, as I have already argued, has been classified. They have been placed in a group, especially of their own, based on a chromosome that they involuntarily have. They can't control the fact that their chromosomes, as they were growing in the womb, changed and mutated, and that mutation kept getting copied and copied and copied over again. This isn't something including things such as race, nationality, ethnicity. All of these are involuntary groups. Arguably so is Down syndrome, is it not? I've also looked at the international tribunals, and I've looked at international law to see, well, if I'm arguing that this should be expanded, can it actually be expanded? And guess what? It can. For example, in the Prosecutor versus John Paul, the International Tribunal for the first time held that rape could be a definition within genocide. Now, based on the International Convention, rape is not actually mentioned. And what the court did beautifully in this very, very long decision that I've read, and it put me to sleep only twice. But in this decision, they essentially said that due to the fact that rape is, number one, against somebody's will, but it also forces that individual, if they become pregnant, to carry on genes, and it forces them to have certain evils brought into this world, then that is considered genocide, because we are taking out and eliminating this other group, possibly recreating, and we are having this unforeseen, forcible group come in and be recreated. But international law hasn't stopped there. I read about a Rome statute that was expanded. And this expansion included gay, lesbian, and bisexual groups. Now, I don't bring this up because I want to offend, and I don't bring this up as something to be trendy to go along with the times. But I bring this up specifically because the Rome statute included this on, quote, an involuntary basis. The lawmakers believed that gays, lesbians, bisexuals, based on an involuntary basis, based on involuntary things that they cannot control, needed to be afforded protections. Down syndrome is an involuntary thing. It cannot be controlled in the womb, and it cannot be controlled by the persons that are affected by it. How much more persuasive is the Rome Statute for international legislation, for international reform, to marginally expand to include political groups that could include gays on an involuntary basis, lesbians on an involuntary basis, and Down syndrome on an involuntary basis? I think that the legal community should jump at this. And I also think that this is a beautiful demonstration of the fact that internationally, it is being recognized that groups should be included, that there should be afforded protections for people, that this is an elastic thing, that the law is not so rigorous that it cannot change with the time. Another interesting piece that I found when I was researching was that the special rapporteur had argued at least twice that there should be a marginal expansion for political groups being added. And it wasn't 20 years ago that they argued this, and it wasn't 30 years ago. It was within the last 10 years. And I think based on that, we should all find a little bit of hope that Down syndrome and people who are living with Down syndrome could eventually have protections in the Rome Statute or even in the convention itself to have protections against being sought out and exterminated. So with that, and with this hopeful thought, I decided, all right, Emily, I got to leave these people with some sort of yes, silver lining, bright line, and I think that I found something that at least encouraged me when I was researching. In 2017, Poland actually recognized the fact that this is a serious issue. And Poland is a little bit more of a conservative state within the European Union. And in fact, their prime minister has been going back and forth with Parliament regarding a bill to protect and to support persons with Down syndrome and to actively discourage is probably the best sort of term for aborting persons with Down syndrome. And more specifically, the Prime Minister of Poland said, "I'm sure the bill will find great support in our parliamentary group. And of course," she said, "of course, I will vote for its adoption. I oppose eugenic abortion." I think that is incredible, and I think that's very revolutionary, especially in this argument, because there are not a lot of European politicians that are outright saying, I do not support eugenic abortion. Majority of persons that I've read up on have said this is a great thing, this is wonderful, we will eradicate this. 2030 is the year that we will be free of this disease. And yet here we are, only a couple of months ago, this prime minister specifically said she opposed this. And in addition to that, a Polish group called Stop Abortion Committee, very original, says it's already collected 200,000 signatures in order for this specific law that is before Parliament in Poland to be passed. That's pretty incredible. And that again shows me, and hopefully persuades you, that the law is elastic. It is not rigorous, and it can be changed. I don't know if any of you guys had seen Mr. John Franklin Stevens on CNN, I believe. He appeared before the 37th session of the Human Rights Council. And before I go on, it should be noted that Mr. Stevens actually has Down syndrome. And he appeared before this session. And he said, "The most important thing that can be done to improve the lives of people with Down syndrome is to remember their status as human beings equal in dignity to everyone else." That's what it is, dignity. And it's for you and I to remember that we are humans and that persons with Down syndrome are humans. Just because they have an extra chromosome doesn't make them any less human than you or I are today. In fact, and hopefully I've been able to persuade you that these persons encourage others to be better. They love their lives. They are happy with their lives. They're happy with who they are. And if we don't stop this, and if we don't recognize the certain stages that are before us now, what's going to stop us from just aborting Down syndrome fetuses? I think that's all I have for now. I'm going to open up the floor to everyone for questions that you may have. Really no questions? Sadie, yes.
You mentioned that the proponents of terminating Down syndrome fetus say that one of them said that it was not ending something that had started,
Right,
but stopping something before it had started.
right.
So how would you persuade someone of that mentality that terminating that life in the womb is not is actually ending something that has started?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think that this argument really balances the line between human rights and a right to life argument, and it's very hard to sit down and tell people and not delineate from the human rights aspect of it, because it can go very much right to life-ish. So in my personal opinion, I think it's difficult to persuade somebody like that, especially because they have it in their mind that this is not something of potency, and this is not something that actually deserves recognition. And I think that my biggest argument to that person would be, listen, this needs to be recognized. This extra chromosome needs to be acknowledged. And if this person didn't have this extra chromosome, would we be here having this conversation right now? And I think that that would in turn be able to lead into discussing the fact that human dignity should not be defined solely by that, if that makes sense. I think that in talking to persons like that, it's an uphill battle that I have, and I know that in the grand scheme of things, it's a losing battle that I fight, and that's okay. And especially based on precedents, and especially based on what the Supreme Court has said in things such as Roe v. Wade, that is definitely something that people have argued before to me, and I get it as an aspiring attorney. I hear it, I understand precedents, but I also think that human dignity should trump precedents, and I think that human dignity and a person who has an extra chromosome should be definitely recognized. If this answers your question, or am I just...
Because to say that it's a genocidal trend,
Right.
you have to presuppose that the life in the womb is human.
Absolutely. I think you're right.
If there are people who don't recognize the humanity of that unborn
Yeah.
person, then
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you bring up a really great point, and I think majority of what I like to counter when people say, oh, well, it's not a life is, well, do you recognize that a single-cell amoeba is life? Well, yes. Then what's the difference between a single-celled amoeba and a cell called a zygote that eventually has this ability to grow into a human being? What is the difference between the two? And a lot of people can't answer that question for me. And so I think that that's sort of where life boils down. And a lot of people might say that I'm crazy to think that, and a lot of people might say that it's invalid. But again, it does boil down to certain persons' beliefs and certain persons' ideals of whether life begins at a certain point or whether it begins at another point. And for me, at least, and again, veering off a little bit into the right to life argument, I do think that Down syndrome fetuses are life, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question? Okay. Okay, perfect. Yes?
Ms. Fernandez.
Yes.
I'm really glad I stuck around for your talk.
Thank you.
It's odd that my daughter, my young adult daughter, and I were having a conversation about just this issue.
Really?
Over Easter, you know.
Wow.
We were playing on column.
Yeah.
But, we were just chatting about this, and she's in neuroscience. She's a neuroscientist. And
She's really smart.
Yes, she is.
Wow.
So debating with my daughter is my own special practice.
That is a beautiful thing.
She works at Children's Hospital
Okay.
in LA, so she works saving the lives of children who are suffering from cancer.
Wow.
Some of them supposedly can't be saved.
Okay.
And so I will be sharing a lot of what you just, shared with me
Yeah.
because we were on opposite sides of this. I'm on your side. But playing devil's advocate.
Of course. I love it.
When you laid out your three issues about suffering, finances, and the independence regarding the family.
Yes.
I'm posing this to you because you have political aspirations.
Of course.
On the finance side, you only discussed the family's financial burden.
Yeah.
And then you acted as though the government's resources being funneled to assist this child are just going to materialize out of thin air. So did you do any research into the expenses that the government will incur? And how would you answer that as perhaps a budding political?
Yeah. This is brilliant. I love it. Love the challenge. Okay, I didn't research too much into the amount that the state would actually be paying, and I didn't research into that because I think I get caught in research land, and I will be there for hours and days, and I think that it would have sort of taken away from the overall argument. So I was not able to actually completely research into that. I do know that there is an application process that goes on, that the family does have to go through certain procedures, and they do have to apply to the state, and then the state does have to approve the certain funds that will be going to the family. And of course, it's not for the family, it is specifically for the child. And then, okay, so what was the second part of it? The burden on the state. I think that's, the burden on the state, though, it shouldn't necessarily come to that simply based on the 10th Amendment, because the states have the police powers to protect, and they're supposed to do certain things for the people, for the citizens of the state. And I think that almost, if the state comes out and argues and says, well, we actually can't support you because it's a burden on us, well, that's almost a due process denial of the laws of the state argument that you could get into. And you could say, well, I mean, so you're just, because I have Down syndrome and it's a burden on you, you're just going to tell me no? I don't think that would eventually materialize simply because of the due process clause and because of the almost obligations to protect that the state does have for certain persons. Okay, state, and then what was the second half of that?
Well, you were discussing proposed legislation.
Okay.
That's why I wanted to get
Right.
You brought it into
Of course.
conversation.
Right.
But you didn't address the financial burden.
Okay.
The taxpayers' financial
The tax. Okay.
That's
So
really what I'm-
the tax. So we're getting to the taxpayers. Okay. Well.
That's where the money comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that would roll into the 14th Amendment, 10th Amendment sort of arguments of due process. And I mean, look at disability right now in and of itself. If taxpayers are going to argue that that's a burden, that special needs and state funding is a burden, well, let's look at our disability budgets as well. And let's look at our temporary disability budget, because there's a lot of burden on the taxpayers that goes towards that. So I think that might not necessarily come to full fruition. But I know that the legislation that I specifically brought up was regarding elective abortions for Down syndrome fetuses. And it was specifically trying to outlaw them, to say that you couldn't do it. Or it shouldn't be permitted in certain states. And I think that that's more what the legislation was going for, rather than saying, we're burdening the taxpayers way too much, and as a state, we can't do it. Based on my research regarding the legislation, that it wasn't money related, if that makes sense. Did I answer your question?
Sure.
But to follow up, why is it insurance companies in Europe that want to give bounties on aborting tested fetuses for Down syndrome?
That's a great question, and I don't actually have an answer for that. Yeah, definitely. It's something to look into, and I think that it's really interesting when it comes into that financial issue, because how much of this is a financial issue and how much of this is, yeah, it shouldn't. I've seen your hand up for a while. Hey, hang on. Did I answer your question?
Oh, we're going to talk some more later.
Okay. All right. Oh, boy. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Second of all, while you were speaking, I thought of the fact that in Switzerland they engage in embryonic chromosome correction policies, which is where if they see some type of non-neurotypical
Right.
development,
Yeah.
correct it. Would you consider that a form of like passive genocide, without lack of better defining it, or is that under human rights ethically moral because it gives the embryo a chance at life, just not a non-neurotypical life?
How old are you?
21.
Are you in college? Are you going to go to law school?
Yes.
Good for you. Okay. The dean's right back there. He'll tell you all about how great our school is. Terrific question. Did anybody else hear? Did everybody hear what she had to say in the back? Okay. Stand. Come on. This is what you do in law school. It's preparation.
So my question was about, in Switzerland, they do embryonic chromosome correction policies, which is where if they detect any type of non-neurotypical development in the embryo, they correct it in the embryonic process in the very early stages of detection. And so my question was, would that be considered a form of like passive genocide, since it's taking away like a key feature of that embryo's existence and replacing it with something else, or under human rights, is that ethically moral because that embryo still has a chance to live life?
That's a beautiful, well done. You should have given the presentation. I think it is a sense of almost this incognito genocide, because if you think about it, you're going into the mother before this child has any further room to develop, and you are correcting something that has been deemed as flawed or not perfect. And it's really difficult to bring this up because I don't want to get too deep into it, but that's what the Nazis did, actually. They had a regime that was specifically ordered to go out for lives that were deemed not worthy to be lived, and they took children that were disabled, that were disfigured, that were not deemed worthy lives. Now, I think that's a little bit extreme, but I think when you boil it down to what they're doing in Switzerland, it's the same exact concept. They're taking and they're extracting the imperfections in order to make it more viable per se, but you don't know the implications of that until the child comes to life. And that also goes to the suffering argument where, all right, so we went in when you were an embryo and we did this and we did that, and now your right leg is shorter than your left leg. And how much is that child going to suffer had they just been left alone to typically develop? So I think that that's really brilliant that you've thought of that. And I do think that it's sort of this incognito genocide of we want to eradicate this even before it comes to full term. Very smart. You're smart. You're going to do great things. Yes?
So in Iceland, you said they're now already at 100%.
Right.
And you also mentioned that they're being paid by the insurance companies.
Right.
Is that then truly the mother's choice, or is that now being forced upon by the government? Saying, it's like the mother could just say, I mean, I do want this child, even
right.
though I already know. But is it really her choice to do what she wants with technically her body?
Right.
And it's her body at that point.
Right, yeah, exactly.
I mean, is it then forcibly saying, we get to say what you're doing with your body?
I think I 100% agree with what you're saying right now, and I think that it does balance this fine line of we are incentivizing you with these counselors who are paid by the state and who come and who are going to sit and walk you through these steps, and don't worry, it's okay. It's great. We're just, so it does seem a bit coercive in nature, doesn't it? And then with the health insurance companies to come back and say, hey, we will actually compensate you for getting rid of this potential child that you could have. I do think it is very coercive in nature, but I also haven't necessarily found enough research to back an argument like that. Otherwise, 100% I would be there with you, and I do think that it does almost in turn take away from the mother's ability to choose. And I know, at least on one specific video that I watched in Iceland, these pregnant mothers who chose not to abort, who chose not even to take the non-invasive blood test, they said, this is my body, this is my child, and whatever I'm going to have is what I'm going to have. And I know personally that a few friends who are pregnant or who have had a child now have said that even in their own lives, they went in and the doctor was like, hey, we need to do these tests, like it's gonna be great, it's gonna help you. But then if you step back and you're like, whoa, wait, let me think. You're asking me to look into this so that abortion is an option for me? It seems a bit coercive, right? And I think that I 100% you raise a good point that it does seem a bit like it's depriving somebody of their choice.
A violation of federal law to allow U.S. funds to be spent on writing women in very poor countries to be sterilized. It was in practice 30 years ago to give women in India and Bangladesh, for example, a SAR and a little bit of deal rights or something. If they would get sterilized, and these mass sterilization
Yeah, absolutely. And you had something else to follow up with?
I just wondered,
Yeah.
so would any pregnancy that fell under different genetic makeup, so let's say not just autism, but
Yeah.
now we're looking at Down syndrome, now
Yeah.
we're looking at, like, would this genocide of just one, would others fall under it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. What's fascinating is I've done a lot of research on the prenatal scan. So they're actually called a quadruple scan. And what they do is they scan for specific proteins in the blood, as I mentioned. But these proteins are not only used to find out whether or not the fetus has Down syndrome, but it's also to determine whether or not this child has spina bifida. And I didn't look specifically into the spina bifida issue, but my hunch is that if doctors are encouraging for Down syndrome alone, I wouldn't be surprised if spina bifida was right up there as well. And I do think that things such as autism or Asperger's or things like that, I think that is a possibility in the near future, especially because we are doing things like in Switzerland, we are going in prematurely and arguably trying to fix these things that are coming up. And who's not to say that Down syndrome isn't just a springboard for what's to come? I mean, it could even boil down to people with brown hair and brown eyes. I mean, people who's named Emily. That would never happen because we're talking about fetuses, but you know what I mean?
I mean, you're just getting into like a slippery slope of, like what she said,
Exactly.
genetic modification.
Yeah.
Just saying, well, I want my child to have blonde hair, blue eyes.
Yeah.
When my entire family has brown hair and brown eyes.
Absolutely. There is a designer baby trend that's going on right now. Actually, a couple celebrities have used designer baby methods to have a certain type of child. I mean, all right, if that's what you want to do, go for it. But I think that there is some ethical line that we all must face and say, well, you can go for it, but is this really ethically right? Is this ethically what we should do? Sit here and pick out our child to have blue eyes and blonde hair and only do this? No, I don't think it's ethically correct. But yes.
Yeah, well, thank you for your paper. And
Yeah.
I appreciate also the intuitions that you've shown even in the dialogue here, because it sounds like you're, resisting. You gave those three criteria that are sometimes invoked, but it sounds like you're resisting the idea of letting it all hinge on, how much money the government has to pay, because that's the government's responsibility.
Yeah.
Whether there's suffering present or not, because that's the human condition. And I really want to affirm that intuition. I think that because other conditions like spina bifida and whatever are like right behind Down syndrome
Yeah.
in this argument, you may win some of those, those specific criteria arguments on Down syndrome, but
Right.
you're going to lose them on other conditions.
Yeah.
So the point is not an argument over certain conditions or criteria. It's a human rights issue.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I think that's where we continue to have to steer the discussion to. So I appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah.
A couple of comments. Wonderful topic and presentation. Just did a wonderful job.
Thank you.
Now, Professor Deloche mentioned that your paper topic, the first two words are chromosomal cleansing.
Yes.
I love that. And now that the discussion's evolved more based upon what this gentleman was talking about,
Right.
Dr. Kellner, other issues. So I think that you can strengthen your argument by actually focusing on chromosomal cleansing, because when you start to talk
Yeah.
about all these things, Down syndrome, those might be more tolerated. People
Absolutely.
want to fix it. Down syndrome, they may just want to eliminate. But I think if you draw across the board and show that all of these are equal, but it's the same thing.
Yes.
I think you strengthen your argument.
That's beautiful. I love that.
But going back to the question from the back earlier, you're also talking about the right to life versus the human rights issue.
Right.
And I think that an abortion, the run-of-the-mill abortions, that is an issue of people, I think, in those situations have been persuaded that it's not a life.
Absolutely.
But it is a life.
Yeah.
Convenient life, or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Now, the Down syndrome abortion, it presupposes a life, but it's a flawed life. These are both arguments that are counter to our understanding of human
Absolutely.
Those are things that came to mind when you were talking.
Absolutely. Those are
And
beautiful.
then, I also, in both cases, the run-of-the-mill abortions, you call them, or Down syndrome abortions or chromosomal cleansing
Right.
abortions, what they all do is they shift the argument away from whether it's human being or not.
Yeah.
They shift it on, the argument shifts to what is the burden caused by
Yes.
to put onto others. And you
Yes.
touched upon those too, and you did it with some clever humor too about saying, children are, burden and life's a struggle and things like that.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important point to strengthen. And
Absolutely.
to talk about is, wait, we're getting off topic here. How it impacts the lives of others. We're talking about a life.
Right.
And also too, harkening back to the Nazis, the arguments they used, they were the reasons to kill. It wasn't the reasons people were human beings.
Right.
Look, they created reasons to kill and reasons to rationalize what they were doing.
Right.
I had a long discussion at lunch with Dr. Kilner about my own theory that I wanted to expand on. Or actually, theory is sort of a term, but it's that, even, so we look at life as a continuum. It starts at conception. That's what Christians understand to be true. And
Right.
Science shows that. But even Christians, I think, look at life as, well, do they meet the person when the person's born? So a couple years ago, I came up with the term, and I'm going to develop this into a paper. I came up with the term that a child is, while they're in utero, is in the gestational stage of life.
Ah.
And it's
Hey.
all as a one long continuum. So
Right.
if you begin to ask people, to encourage people to think about it that way, they get away from the argument of, a woman's body argument. Unfortunately, it's been persuasive of, telling someone else what to do with their body. They get off track. Again,
Right.
we're talking about human rights and the rights of the
Absolutely.
So something else that you could even just think about.
Yeah.
Gestational stage, toddler stage, child, teen,
Young adult, yeah.
It's all one continuum.
Absolutely.
And one final point I want to say that it just sprang to my mind that the whole, we talk about designer babies, and one of
Right.
the other issues now is surrogacy.
Yes.
Surrogacy runs counter to the argument that it's a woman's body.
Yeah, it does. I mean,
Huge,
think about that.
shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah.
All these people that might tend to say, well, I don't, I believe in abortion and I want to do surrogacy, and they're just getting away from, kind of a more natural way of doing things. So I see people in those the pro-abortion can't be
Right.
kind of pro-surrogacy, pro-3-parent children,
Yeah.
chromosomal cleansing or chromosomal repair. That's a whole.
Yeah.
That's a lot of thoughts.
No, I love it.
Encourage.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. I saw your hand. I'll get to you.
I like to press it by saying it's a two-part question.
Yeah.
The first question being, as far as blood tests go,
Yeah.
is there a legal precedent for this both internationally and domestically for the United States? Because you say individuals are coerced into taking this blood test early on to determine whether or not the child has Down syndrome, and you stated before it started in the 60s for our government at least. So is there an international precedent that has been passed that allows for this because it's become so widespread in Europe and the United States?
Okay, so the first thing is, I don't think my argument is coercion. It's more or less, I think coercion was a term that I just used in dialogue, and it appeared to be coercion. I don't think it's coercion necessarily. I think it's something that has been implemented and has been a part of medical practices that people haven't really thought of, if that makes sense. But precedence in what sense? Are we talking just, oh, this is precedence, hey, we've enacted this to be legal, or precedence as in this is illegal or this should be illegal?
I suppose the question I'm going to ask then is a standard procedure then, as far as medical procedures go.
Gotcha.
There is something that is generally accepted and understood that this is a practice that all people in hospitals or whoever conducts these blood tests go through.
Yeah, absolutely. So I looked into both American and into European medical practices, and actually the practice bulletin that I mentioned earlier in my speech, that was implemented in 2004 by the American Gynecologists and Obstetricians, and since then that has sort of been implemented into medical practices. I wouldn't call it precedence, because when I think precedence, I think legal. I would say that it's more of a medical practice or more of a medical process. It's not necessarily that you have to do it. It's not coercion. It is more of a mentioned and a very heavy-handed suggestion, if that makes sense. And I also looked into European practices, and they too have implemented it, especially into their training. So I specifically looked into the United Kingdom's training, and they said, oh yes, you need to suggest these certain things at this certain stage. So I guess if what you're looking for is, yes, these have been a part of medical practices for at least the last decade, then yes. But legal precedents, I don't think there is any sort of legal precedents, if that's what you're looking for.
What happens, they call it best practices.
Yes, yeah.
Standard medical practice or best practices, then what that means is if the doctor doesn't require it, then he or she is liable.
Right,
for
ethically.
wrongful life
Right.
problems on the other side.
Right.
And so that's the way they get pressured into insisting
Heavy-handed.
patients to become heavy-handed.
Right.
So the patients will have the test
Yes.
because they don't want to have trouble on the other side.
Right, exactly. Okay, so your second part.
Yeah, but then based off of that, assessing that then, and looking at countries in Europe such as Iceland where the abortion rate is now reaching 100%, you spoke of how 3 women last year rejected this, but given the fact that there's no real legal accepted practice and it's rather standard medical procedure to suggest it as it being best practice, then how do we practically resolve the question of genocide that is happening in these countries where it is not a legal practice that is instated legally, but rather it is more of a culturally accepted practice medically? Then how are we to alleviate the genocide that is both either active in Iceland or passive in countries like Switzerland where this is occurring?
So there's actually terms in human rights law. So there are different, I'm going to butcher it. It's not the state's laws, it's like cultural law. I'm totally blanking on it right now. Yes. So, yes. The margin of appreciation. So there's this, it is such a wonky term to try to explain, and I have tried to mull it over in my brain time and time again, and it is this weird sort of almost like, I wish I had a whiteboard. It's like if this is the standard across Europe and Iceland is here because they believe this, and then Ireland is over here because they don't actually permit abortions, then what's the margin of appreciation going to do to sort of, customary law, that was it. What is the margin of appreciation going to do to try to balance this out, right? So this is what the European Union is trying to do, but they fail at it all the time. And if you've ever tried to do anything regarding the European Union or even regarding the UN, some of the stuff that they have going is just really super wonky, and it doesn't work on a very global or expansive kind of platform. But I think when it comes to the customary law that you're talking about, it's very key to have people such as the Prime Minister in Poland who actively comes out and says, I oppose this type of abortion. I oppose this. And I think that that is going to answer your question, and that is going to actually combat the genocide that we have before us today, is to get people to recognize that, yes, this is not okay ethically, this is not okay on a human rights scale, this is not okay morally, and for them to actively combat it. So I think it would be almost, I don't want to say impossible, but I think I would have a lot of difficulties trying to persuade someone in Iceland when I am in fact not Icelandic to change customary law, if that makes sense. I think in order for this to be globally recognized, in order for customary law to be combated and to be changed, it has to come from persons of that area, if that makes sense. Who else had so many hands? Wait, you had your hand up first, and then you had your hand, and then this area. Okay, yes?
Well, first of all, I have a friend whose son is Down syndrome, and
Yeah.
he happens to be the main greeter at the LA Angels. So if you go to
Oh, no way, that's awesome. He's a greeter. Yeah, okay.
he's an amazing person. I'm with him in my spirit every time I see him, and so if people could just meet somebody like that,
Yeah,
who has Down syndrome,
agreed.
and realize that, man, this person adds a lot more to society than I do.
Yeah,
And that's what they would have a different attitude.
yeah, absolutely.
My question has to do with this gray area
Yeah.
talk about the gray area where there's some probability that a positive test is not, is inaccurate, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the gray area, or that was one of the gray areas. So in other words, it's discounted, the humanity of this
Right.
child is discounted if the test is positive, even though the test may be incorrect.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in a sense, it's discounting the humanity of the fetus regardless.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think that's something to point out.
Yeah.
Essentially discounting the humanity of the
No, I think that's brilliant. Yeah, you definitely teased out a good, I have like a couple. I was getting there. Everybody stop yelling at me. I saw your hand up.
My hand was to tell you to obey.
I'm going to say this into the mic. I knew I shouldn't have brought my parents. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I can answer your question a little bit further, and the gentleman in the front, I can answer your question on the precedence versus medical. On the purely medical end, in the state of California, the insidious underlying thing that happens is that the blood test that you were talking about is a screen. It is not, it is the first step, so it's a screen. And with best medical practices, this was happening 25 years ago, because when I was 21 weeks with her,
Hey.
my obstetrician, my OBGYN, gave me all of these pamphlets and very strong-handedly insisted that it would be a good idea if I had these screenings. So, of course, I rejected the test screening for both of them. And that was my choice. It's still a choice in the state of California. I'm only speaking in the state of California. But what is happening with the insidious nature of this globally is that what the choices and the pressure is happening on only screening, so that there's abortion happening and a decision happening only upon screening, which has a very high false positive rate. So you're
Right.
on.
Yeah, definitely.
And the precedence is that gray area, which is medical best practices and the OBGYNs covering their tushies to a certain degree, but also it getting into the financial, the burden of the insurance company. Any insurance company wants premiums, but they don't want to pay out.
Absolutely.
So that also goes into, working with the physician population on the private.
Yeah.
But the shared burden with the state that you had a question on was that there is a impairment rating for state disability in the Down syndrome population, like you had indicated
Right.
in your research,
Right.
is mild mod.
Yep.
So the impact is very limited, but they also go back and what we call is reintegration into society, and they become very thoughtful and very equal members of society, getting jobs, paying taxes, and putting into the system that they grew from.
Right.
And in the state of California, we have something called the State Department of Rehabilitation, which are set aside monies that are in the state budget, and this State Department of Rehabilitation has existed in California for at least over 30 years. It
Right.
was there before I started doing what I do. So
Yeah, absolutely.
answering just
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you bring up. And again, like I mentioned in the lecture portion of it, these are not conclusive at all. And in fact, these are just sort of indicators per se. And further tests should be had. If this is something that people are genuinely concerned about, you need to look at, again, the size of the heart, the size of the baby, looking at the bone structure. That is more determinative than these non-invasive initial scans that are being sort of brought out right now. Yes?
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah.
It has special meaning to me. Both my sister and I were pre-screened to have Down syndrome. Neither of us do. I was a 3 and 4.
Woo! She's a survivor.
On the topic of false positives, I was a false positive. So
No way. Oh my gosh, hi. I'm Emily. No, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding.
But I have an actual question. My question
Yeah.
is that in the case of the Ohio law,
Yes.
is it the case that the legislative body and then the judicial body and Justice Black made their arguments based on liberty and discrimination, or was it an argument of a bioethical question? And then if so, does this whole debate shift from what it seems you are making it to be sort of bioethical question,
Right.
a question of medical genocide versus a legal question in regards to liberty and discrimination, the way that the general abortion debate has become?
Right. I'm liking this table right here. You guys are young, aspiring humans, and this is great. I really hope that you continue going to law school. You're going to law school, right? Good for you. I really hope that you guys follow through with that because you have very, very great questions. Okay, so based on, I just wanted to make sure that I have this right before I answer your question because I think this is a really good question. Did everybody hear it, by the way? Okay. The judge actually made this decision based on constitutional grounds. So he said that it was a decision to terminate before viability. Now, viability based on the Supreme Court's precedents actually states in cases, I cannot think of the case off the top of my head right now, but it says that viability, a legal term, is when a child is actually able to survive outside of the womb without help. So that is the viability standard. Now, there are a bunch of other standards that you will learn when you go to law school, yay for you, in constitutional law that say, okay, these are certain times when it is constitutional to abort and when it is not unconstitutional to abort, and viability comes into that. So based on this viability argument, the judge actually made his decision on constitutional precedents. Now, the constitutional precedents, viability, well, what is that on? It's actually on the right to privacy. And if any of you have read the Constitution, there is no right to privacy quoted in the Founding Fathers' language. This is something that has evolved over time and something that the United States has actually set as a right that we have, specifically founded in the Fourth Amendment. So the Fourth Amendment gives us our right to privacy, especially when it comes to criminal law. Oh, I could talk about that all day long. Your girl wants to be a prosecutor, so I could talk about that all day long. But based on this specifically, he based it on viability and the right to privacy. The right to privacy then stems off into the right to abort. Where in the Constitution did the Founding Fathers write, you have the right to abort? It's not there. How did it become? Well, based on the right to privacy, which was based on all of these other things that the Supreme Court has said. So to get to your question, the judge based this solely on constitutional grounds, mainly viability, which stems into the right to privacy, which almost stems into what my kind friend back here was talking about, is the woman's right to her body.
Did the legislative body make their argument for for a law against abortion based on discrimination and liberty, or was it based on an argument for viability or bioethics? So was it based on they should
Right.
have the right to life based on abortion, or was
Right.
it based on it's Down syndrome, so it's discrimination?
It was based on its discrimination basis. So they were saying, you are singling out these Down syndrome persons. You are saying, we are looking for this. This is not okay. You cannot do that on constitutional grounds. It wasn't a bioethics argument. None of this is actually a bioethics argument, to be quite frank. This is all sort of precedents. Oh, hey, we're going to morph this into some sort of weird thing, and it's an argument. But in reality, this is all a eugenics, a bioethics, and mostly it's a human rights argument because, again, we're talking about the dignity of a person. So to really answer your question, it's all based on discrimination of saying, hey, we're tired of you discriminating and specifically targeting these people, but then the court comes back and says, well, we're going to trump you. SCOTUS said Roe v. Wade, viability and right to privacy, unconstitutional on its face. And when the court says it's unconstitutional on its face, that means that it's completely inapplicable. We can't go forward because it's so unconstitutional as it applies to everybody. So we can't do this. Yeah, one follow-up question, then I think I have time for maybe one more question after that.
So then was the judge saying that it was not discrimination and that it just saying it's not violating?
He was saying it's a violation of a woman's right to privacy.
Okay.
Do you
so
see
he
that?
didn't deal with the
He didn't talk about the discrimination at all. He said it's a deprivation of the woman's right to privacy and the right to choose. He never spoke about that, what you're bringing up right now.
So it wasn't overturning. It wasn't overturning the law, the principle behind the law.
He struck it down.
Okay.
Thank you, by the way. If we assume for the sake of argument that this is not going to result in compulsory eugenics, is there anything besides the possibility that it's going to lead to that makes aborting a Down syndrome fetus any worse than aborting any other fetus? Because in my opinion, I mean, at least looking at the mother, the person who's electing to do this, it seems like there's more of a rational decision made there and a less selfish decision. She's decided to abort the fetus because it may have a poor life, whether or not that's true, at least in her mind. She
Right.
believes that. It seems to me like this is the less bad abortion.
So you're saying it's a less bad abortion to...
Apart from the eugenics argument,
Okay.
I'm just asking, is there a reason why this is any worse than every other abortion?
I would say yes, because it's discriminatory. And as a good constitutional believer and as a good human rights believer, discrimination is at the heart of almost every single great atrocity that I have ever read about. And I think that if we do not face that head on, and if we do not acknowledge that this is discriminatory in its nature, that, oh, well, I mean, if it's a rose, call it a rose, right? If it's an abortion, what the heck, who cares? It's just a Down syndrome abortion. I think that that sweeps the issue under the rug, and the issue is discrimination. And the main issue is discrimination based on fear. Fear of what? Fear that this is not going to pan out the way that people want, fear that this is going to be burdensome, fear that this is going to cost people more money than they want to expend. And I don't think that those are really sound reasons to just sweep under the rug and just say, well, I mean, it's abortion, so we can just carry on. And I think that I'm all out of time. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you for your questions.